Bully slapped. Veteran single dad in a diner, not knowing his son was head of Homeland Security. One cruel slap meant to shame an old man sparked gasps. But when the truth about his powerful son exploded, the bully's world collapsed in seconds. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun crept through the weathered curtains of Frank Delaney's farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. His eyes opened at exactly 5:30 a.m., just as they had every day since Vietnam. Some habits, formed in the jungle heat decades ago, never quite let go. Frank's joints creaked as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. Rusty, his elderly golden retriever, lifted his head from his bed in the corner, tail thumping softly against the floor. The old dog's muzzle had gone gray, much like Frank's own hair, but his eyes still held that same faithful warmth. "Morning, old friend," Frank said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Rusty's ears. "Another day, huh?" The morning routine was as familiar as breathing. Frank pulled on his faded jeans and a clean plaid shirt, then made his way to the back door. The small garden he'd planted after Margaret passed away needed tending. It wasn't much, just some tomatoes, green beans, and his wife's favorite flowers. But it gave him purpose. The earth felt cool and damp beneath his fingers as he pulled a few persistent weeds. Rusty lounged nearby in a patch of sunlight, watching with half-closed eyes as Frank worked. The morning air carried the sweet scent of late summer, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called. "Getting hungry there, boy?" Frank asked, noticing Rusty's expectant look. The old dog's tail wagged harder at the mention of breakfast. Inside, Frank filled Rusty's bowl with kibble and fresh water, then grabbed his worn leather wallet and keys. "Be good now," he told Rusty, giving him one last pat before heading out to his old pickup truck. The engine coughed twice before turning over, and Frank eased onto the quiet country road leading into town. Mary's Diner sat on the corner of Main and Oak, its neon sign still glowing faintly in the morning light. Frank had been coming here for breakfast every morning since Margaret died 3 years ago. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, and the familiar smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around him like a warm blanket. "Morning, Mr. Delaney," Sarah's cheerful voice called out from behind the counter. The young waitress's smile was genuine and warm, just like it always was. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her green apron was already showing signs of the morning rush. "Morning, Sarah," Frank replied, settling into his usual booth by the window. "Busy morning?" "Just picking up," she said, already pouring him a cup of coffee. "The usual?" Frank nodded, grateful for her kindness. "You know me too well." The diner slowly filled with the morning regulars, farmers stopping in before heading to their fields, office workers grabbing coffee before work, and retirees gathering for their daily conversations. Frank sipped his coffee, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere and watching the town wake up outside the window. The bell chimed again, but this time the sound was followed by loud, heavy footsteps. A man in his 30s strode in, his presence immediately filling the small diner with an uncomfortable energy. His t-shirt stretched tight across his chest, and a baseball cap sat low over his eyes. "Hey," he called out roughly. "Someone gonna take my order or what?" Sarah approached his table, order pad in hand. "Good morning, sir. What can I get for you?" The man's eyes narrowed as he looked up at her, his lip curling into a sneer. "Well, look what we got here," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Didn't know they let your kind serve food in this town." The diner grew quieter. Sarah's smile faltered, but she kept her professional demeanor.
"Sir, I'd be happy to take your order if you'd like breakfast."
"Maybe I don't want your hands touching my food," the man continued, his voice getting louder. "How do I know it'll be clean?" Frank's hands tightened around his coffee cup. He watched as Sarah's shoulders tensed, though she maintained her composure. Other customers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. The man continued his tirade, using words that made Frank's stomach turn. Words he'd heard before, words that had no place in this diner or anywhere else. Sarah stood there, taking it. Her face, a mask of forced patience. Frank couldn't stay silent any longer. Setting down his coffee cup, he cleared his throat and spoke up. "That's enough." The man's head snapped toward Frank's booth. "What did you say, old-timer?" "I said that's enough," Frank repeated, his voice steady and clear. "The lady's trying to do her job. There's no call for that kind of talk here." The man stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked over to Frank's booth, towering over him. Well, looks like we got ourselves a hero." He leaned down, his face inches from Frank's. "What's the matter, Pops? Missing your glory days?" Frank met his gaze calmly. "Son, I just think you ought to show the lady some respect." "Respect?" The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Look at you, sitting here acting all high and mighty. You're nothing but a washed-up old man who doesn't know when to mind his own business." The diner had gone completely silent now. Every eye was on them, but Frank didn't back down. He thought of all the times he'd seen hatred wear different faces. In the jungle, on the streets, when he came home, and now here in his own town. "I've seen enough hatred in my life," Frank said quietly. "Don't need to see any more of it here." The man's face twisted with rage. Before anyone could react, his hand shot out, striking Frank across the face with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent diner. Frank's head snapped to the side, his cheek stinging from the impact. Time seemed to freeze. Coffee cups hung suspended halfway to mouths. Forks stopped midway to plates. The only sound was the quiet hum of the ceiling fans and the heavy breathing of the man who just struck him. Frank slowly turned his head back, facing his attacker. He could feel the heat rising in his cheek, where the man's hand had connected. Could taste a hint of blood where his lip had caught against his teeth. But he didn't move. Didn't retaliate. He just sat there, his eyes steady, his dignity intact despite the assault. The silence in the diner was absolute, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The sharp crack of the slap echoed through the diner, followed by a deafening silence. Frank's weathered cheek stung as he steadied himself against the counter, his calloused hand gripping the smooth surface. The bully's cruel laughter cut through the quiet like a knife. "What's the matter, old man? Can't take a little tap?" The younger man's face twisted with smug satisfaction. Before Frank could gather himself, Mr. Carter emerged from behind the counter. The diner manager's normally pleasant expression had hardened into steel. At 65, Carter wasn't much younger than Frank, but he moved with purpose, positioning himself between Frank and the bully. "Get out of my diner." Carter's voice was low but carried the weight of authority. "Now." The bully's smirk faltered. "I said now." Carter took a step forward, his weathered hands balled into fists. "And don't come back. Ever." The bully glanced around the diner, perhaps looking for support, but found only cold stares. With a final sneer, he backed away and pushed through the glass door, letting it slam behind him. Sarah rushed to Frank's side, a damp cloth in her hand. "Here, Mr. Delaney." Her gentle touch against his cheek made him wince. "I'm so sorry. Let me help." Other patrons gathered around. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. Bob Wilson, the hardware store owner, pulled up a chair. "Sit down, Frank. Take it easy." "I'm calling the sheriff," Mr. Carter announced, already reaching for the phone behind the counter. Frank wanted to protest, to say it wasn't necessary, but his voice seemed stuck somewhere in his throat. The kindness of his neighbors somehow made the humiliation sharper. He'd faced worse in Vietnam, much worse, but this was different. This had happened at home, in a place where he should have felt safe. "You did the right thing, Frank," Bob said firmly. "Someone needed to stand up to that piece of work." Mrs. Henderson nodded vigorously. The way he was talking to Sarah, it wasn't right. "You're a hero for speaking up." Frank forced a smile, though it felt brittle on his face. "I'm fine, really. Just caught me off guard is all." He touched his cheek gently, the skin still warm from the impact. Sheriff Jenkins arrived 15 minutes later, notebook in hand. His familiar face was creased with concern as he listened to the witnesses. Sarah described the racial slurs, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Carter detailed the assault and the ejection of the troublemaker. He drove off in a blue pickup, Carter added. Couldn't catch the plate number. The sheriff shook his head. We'll keep an eye out, Frank. Want to press charges? Frank straightened his shoulders. No need, Tom. Just a slap. I've had worse. Still, what he did, the sheriff started. I said I'm fine. Frank's tone was perhaps sharper than intended, and he immediately softened it. Thank you, everyone. Really. But I think I'll head home now. Despite protests that he should stay and finish his breakfast, Frank needed air. The diner's concerned faces and sympathetic looks were becoming too much to bear. He placed a few dollars on the counter for his untouched coffee. At least let me drive you, Sarah offered. Walking will do me good, Frank insisted, managing another smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The morning air was crisp as he stepped outside, the sun now fully risen over the small town's main street. His feet carried him automatically toward home, while his mind churned with a soldier's muscle memory, analyzing what he could have done differently, how he could have been better prepared. The anger came in waves, not just at the bully, but at himself. He'd grown soft, let his guard down. In Vietnam, he'd led men through jungle warfare, made split-second decisions that saved lives. Now, he couldn't even defend himself in a diner. The familiar storefronts of Main Street gradually gave way to residential areas. Frank walked steadily, his posture military straight, despite the morning's events. A few neighbors waved from their yards, and he nodded back, wondering if they'd heard about the incident yet. News traveled fast in small towns. What bothered him most wasn't the physical pain. That was nothing. It was the helplessness. The same helplessness he'd felt when he'd returned from Vietnam to find closed doors and turned backs. He'd thought those days were behind him. But here it was again. That familiar taste of injustice. Down the street, a blue pickup idled at the curb, its engine rumbling in the quiet morning air. Frank didn't need to look directly at it to know who sat behind the wheel. His combat-trained senses picked up the hostile presence, even as he maintained his steady pace. The bully's words carried faintly on the breeze. This ain't over, old man. Frank kept walking, his stride never faltering. He'd face down enemy fire in the jungle. He wouldn't give this coward the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. The evening sun cast long shadows across Frank's front porch as he sat in his old wooden rocker, Rusty, lying faithfully at his feet. His cheek no longer stung from the morning's incident, but the humiliation lingered like a bitter taste. The familiar creak of the rocker filled the quiet as his mind wandered back to darker days, times when he'd faced worse than a bully in a diner. Rusty's ears perked up first. Headlights swept across the farmhouse's weathered siding, and the crunch of tires on gravel broke through the evening calm. Frank leaned forward, squinting at the sleek black SUV pulling into his driveway. His heart skipped when a tall figure stepped out even in the dimming light. He'd know that silhouette anywhere. Daniel? Frank's voice cracked slightly as he rose from his rocker. Hey, Dad. Daniel Delaney climbed the porch steps, his government suit looking out of place against the rustic setting. Despite his commanding presence, his eyes held nothing but warmth and concern as he embraced his father. Frank held his son tight, realizing how much he'd missed him. You didn't have to come all this way. Mike Carter called me. Daniel pulled back, his hands still on his father's shoulders. Said some punk put his hands on you at the diner. Frank's jaw tightened. Mike shouldn't have bothered you. You've got more important things. Nothing's more important than this. Daniel's tone was firm but gentle. Can we talk inside? In the kitchen, Frank busied himself making coffee while Daniel loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. The room hadn't changed since Daniel's last visit, same worn linoleum floor, same faded curtains his mother had picked out years ago. The only difference was the small garden's worth of tomatoes ripening on the windowsill. You should have called me yourself, Dad. Daniel accepted the steaming mug his father offered. Frank settled into his chair at the kitchen table. It wasn't worth disrupting your work. You've got the whole country's security to worry about. That's exactly why I'm worried. Daniel leaned forward. A man like that, targeting someone like you. Someone like me? Frank's eyebrows rose. A veteran. A respected member of the community. Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. Someone who stands up to bullies. Frank's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. I've handled worse than some loudmouth kid with a bad attitude. Times are different now, Dad. These types of incidents, they're not always isolated. Daniel's expression grew serious. Men like that, they don't usually stop at one confrontation. Especially when someone stands up to them. Frank studied his son's face, seeing not just the powerful government official, but also the boy who used to run to him with scraped knees and playground troubles. You think he'll be back? I think you need to be careful. Daniel took a slow sip of coffee. Let me have some people keep an eye on the situation. No. Frank's response was immediate. I won't have government agents watching my house because some fellow slapped me at breakfast. Dad, I mean it, Daniel. Frank's voice softened. I appreciate you coming all this way, but I've lived in this town for 40 years, fought in Vietnam, raised you by myself after your mother passed. I can handle one angry young man. They moved to the kitchen table, where Frank had laid out a simple dinner of meatloaf and potatoes, Daniel's favorite from childhood. The familiar smell filled the kitchen with warmth, but couldn't quite dispel the tension in the air. At least let me run his plates, Daniel said, cutting into his meatloaf. The diner must have security cameras. Frank shook his head. You've got to stop thinking like a federal agent for a minute, and remember this is still a small town. We handle things differently here. And how's that working out so far? Daniel couldn't keep the edge from his voice. Because, from where I sit, a man assaulted my father in public and drove away without consequences. Frank set down his fork. There are always consequences, son. Just not always the kind that come with handcuffs and paperwork. They ate in silence for a few moments, the clink of silverware against plates, the only sound. Outside, crickets had started their evening chorus, a familiar soundtrack to their shared meals over the years. I got a bad feeling about this, Dad, Daniel finally said, his voice quieter now. These incidents, they're rarely just random. They're usually part of something bigger. Frank looked at his son, really looked at him. Behind the crisp suit and official demeanor, he saw the weight of knowledge in Daniel's eyes. His boy had seen things, knew things, that Frank could only imagine. I hear you, son, Frank said gently. But I've fought my battles before. I can fight this one. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He recognized that tone in his father's voice, the same one that had declared case closed on countless childhood discussions. Instead, he reached across the table and squeezed his father's hand, the gesture saying what words couldn't. They finished their meal together, talking about lighter things. Daniel's work that he could share, Frank's garden, and the latest town gossip. But underneath their conversation ran a current of unease, like a stream flowing beneath seemingly solid ground. The dawn light crept across Frank's kitchen floor as he poured his first cup of coffee. He'd barely slept, the events from yesterday weighing heavy on his mind. Daniel had taken the guest room upstairs, insisting on staying a few days despite Frank's protests that he was fine. Rusty's sudden barking drew Frank to the front window. The old dog rarely made such a fuss, especially this early. Frank's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips as his eyes fixed on the fence that ran along his property. Bold, angry letters stretched across the white wooden planks. Go back where you came from. The mug trembled slightly in his weathered hands. He set it down carefully on the windowsill, his jaw tightening. The words seemed to mock him, just like the jeers he'd heard decades ago when he'd returned from Vietnam. Heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs behind him. Dad? Daniel's voice was sharp with concern. What's wrong? Frank gestured wordlessly toward the fence. Daniel's face hardened as he took in the cruel message. Without a word, he retrieved his phone from his pocket and stepped onto the front porch, snapping several pictures from different angles. I'll get this documented, Daniel said, his voice carrying the authority of his position. We can have a team analyze the paint pattern, Maybe get some prints. No. Frank's voice was firm. I don't want any federal involvement, son. This is my problem. Daniel turned to face his father, frustration evident in his features. Dad, this is a hate crime. We have resources. And what happens when word gets out that the head of Homeland Security is investigating vandalism in a small Midwest town? Frank shook his head. It'll only make things worse. I won't have you risking your position over some fool with a spray can. They stood in tense silence until Daniel's shoulders finally slumped. At least let me file a local police report? Frank nodded reluctantly. Fine, but nothing more. The morning passed slowly as they worked together to clean the fence. The paint proved stubborn, and Frank's arms ached from scrubbing. Each stroke of the brush seemed to bring back memories of other battles, other times he'd had to rebuild. Around noon, the sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Sarah from the diner stepped out of her old blue sedan, carrying a covered dish. Her face fell as she saw the partially cleaned fence, traces of the hateful message still visible. "Oh, Mr. Delaney," she said softly, climbing the porch steps. "I brought you a chocolate cream pie. I remembered you saying it was your favorite." Frank felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sundae. "That's mighty kind of you, Sarah. Would you like to come in for coffee?" Inside, Sarah set the pie on the kitchen table while Frank poured coffee into his best cups, the ones his late wife had always saved for company. Daniel excused himself to make some calls, leaving them alone in the sunny kitchen. "The whole town's talking about what happened at the diner," Sarah said, accepting her coffee. "Everyone's on your side, Mr. Delaney. Mr. Carter, the diner manager, he's banned that man for life." Frank managed a small smile. "Seems like an awful lot of fuss over nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Sarah insisted, her eyes bright with emotion. "You stood up for me when others just sat there. That means something." She hesitated, then added, "My grandfather was in Vietnam too. He always said the hardest battle was coming home." Frank's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "Your grandfather was a wise man." "The point is," Sarah continued, "you're not alone in this. The community stands with you." She reached across the table and patted his hand. "We take care of our own here." The visit lifted Frank's spirits more than he cared to admit. After Sarah left, the afternoon passed quietly. Daniel made his report to the local police, who promised to increase patrols in the area. Frank tried to keep busy with his usual routines, but an unsettling awareness followed him throughout the day. As evening settled over the farmhouse, Frank stood by his bedroom window, gazing out at the darkened landscape. Rusty lay at his feet, unusually alert for this hour. The familiar shapes of his property, the old barn, the tool shed, the newly cleaned fence, were barely visible in the growing darkness. A flash of headlights swept across the yard, illuminating everything for a brief moment before disappearing down the road. Frank didn't move from the window, but his muscles tensed. The darkness seemed deeper now, more threatening. Rusty let out a low growl. Frank knew, with the certainty born from years of combat experience, that he was being watched. The feeling settled into his bones, like a winter chill. He remained at the window, his reflection staring back at him from the glass, while somewhere out there in the darkness, unseen eyes kept their vigil. The morning dew clung to the tomato plants as Frank knelt in his garden, a worn basket beside him. His weathered hands moved mechanically between the rows, pulling weeds, but his mind wandered far from the present. The fresh soil's earthy scent triggered something deep within him, memories he'd tried hard to bury. The garden blurred, and suddenly he was back there, stepping off the military transport at O'Hare International Airport in '72. The humidity had been suffocating that day, his uniform pressed crisp despite the long flight home. He'd expected. Well, he wasn't sure what he'd expected, but it wasn't what he got. Frank's hands trembled as he gripped a tomato plant's cage. He could still hear the shouts, see the angry faces. "Baby killer!" they'd screamed. A young woman with flowers in her hair had spat directly in his face. He'd stood there, paralyzed, the wetness running down his cheek. while other soldiers hurried past with their heads down. "You all right there, Dad?" Daniel's voice cut through the memory. Frank blinked, finding himself back in his garden. His son stood at the edge of the plot, 2 steaming coffee mugs in hand. "Just thinking," Frank said, accepting the coffee. He settled onto the old wooden bench nearby, his joints protesting the movement. About coming home. Daniel sat beside him, understanding in his eyes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the garden rows. "You never really talked about that part." Frank took a slow sip of coffee. "Didn't see the point in burdening you with it. But yesterday, at the diner." He paused, searching for words. It brought it all back. The hatred in that young man's eyes. It was the same look they had back then. The memories continued to surface, like bubbles rising in still water. The way the supermarket clerk had refused to serve him when she spotted his military haircut. The no vets signs in apartment windows when he'd tried to find a place to live. The whispers and stares that followed him through his own hometown. "I was proud to serve," Frank said quietly. "Did what I thought was right. But coming home," he shook his head. "Sometimes that felt harder than being over there." Daniel listened intently, his own coffee forgotten. Frank rarely opened up like this, and his son knew better than to interrupt. "Your mother, God rest her soul. She understood." Frank's voice softened at the mention of his late wife. She'd say, "Frank Delaney, you hold your head high. You did your duty." But some days, he traced the rim of his coffee mug. Some days, it was hard to believe that was enough. The morning progressed as they sat there, the sun climbing higher. Birds darted between the garden rows, unbothered by human concerns. Frank watched them, finding comfort in their simple presence. "You know why I won't back down from this?" Frank finally said, turning to his son. "Because I spent too many years being quiet, trying not to make waves, thinking if I just kept my head down, the hurt would go away." He straightened his shoulders. "I'm done with that." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand more than you might think, Dad." They sat in comfortable silence until evening, painted the sky in soft oranges and purples. The day's heat began to fade, bringing with it the first whispers of night insects. Frank remained on the porch, now settled in his old rocking chair, when Daniel emerged from the house with 2 glasses of iced tea. "Mind if I join you?" Daniel asked, though he was already lowering himself into the adjacent chair. "Never." Frank accepted the tea, the glass cool against his palm. The crickets filled the quiet between them until Daniel spoke. "You know, Dad, I have nightmares too." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Different from yours, but they keep me up just the same." Frank turned to study his son's face in the fading light. Daniel's features, usually set in determined lines, had softened. "The things I see in my work, the threats I have to track. Sometimes I lie awake wondering if I've done enough, if I've missed something crucial." Daniel's fingers tightened around his glass. "The weight of protecting so many lives, it follows me home, every night." Frank reached over and placed his hand on his son's arm. The gesture spoke volumes between them. "I used to think I needed to be strong all the time," Daniel continued. "Like you. But watching you today, talking about the past, I realized being strong sometimes means admitting when things hurt." The porch creaked gently beneath their chairs as they rocked in unison. Fireflies began to appear in the gathering dusk, their light dancing across the garden where Frank had struggled with his memories that morning. "We carry different scars, son," Frank said softly. "But we carry them the same way, with dignity." They sat together as darkness settled over the farm. 2 generations of Delaney men bound by duty, sacrifice, and the quiet understanding that some battles leave marks that never fully heal. The crunch of gravel under Frank's boots turned to a hollow squish as he stepped onto his dewy front lawn. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the morning sky in soft pinks and purples. His daily routine started with checking his garden and collecting the morning paper from the... He stopped short. Something wasn't right. His old pickup truck sat at an odd angle, and even in the dim light, he could tell all 4 tires were completely flat. Frank's heart quickened as he approached. Deep knife slashes marred the rubber, precise and deliberate. This wasn't random vandalism. "Lord have mercy," he muttered, running his hand along one of the ruined tires. The rubber was still warm, meaning this had happened recently. Very recently. Movement caught his eye, a white piece of paper fluttering on his front porch, held down by a rock. Frank's joints protested as he straightened up and walked toward it. The morning breeze tried to snatch the paper away as he bent to retrieve it, but his fingers were quicker. The message was short, written in thick black marker. "Next time, it's you." Frank's hands trembled slightly as he read the words again. The threat was clear enough, but it was the implication that chilled him. They had been this close to his house while he slept. He heard the screen door creak behind him. "Dad." Daniel's voice was thick with sleep. "What are you doing out here so early?" Frank turned, still holding the note. "Son, we've got trouble." Daniel was fully awake in an instant, his training kicking in as he assessed the situation. He checked the perimeter of the house while Frank called the sheriff, though they both knew it was mostly a formality at this point. Sheriff Jenkins arrived 20 minutes later, his patrol car stirring up dust on the gravel drive. The sun was higher now, highlighting the damage in stark detail. The sheriff's weathered face grew grimmer as he examined each tire. "Clean cuts," Jenkins observed, crouching beside one wheel. "Professional work. Not just angry slashing." He straightened up with a grunt. "And you say you found this note on the porch?" Frank handed over the paper, now sealed in a plastic bag that Daniel had insisted upon. The sheriff studied it, his frown deepening. "Look, Frank." Jenkins began, removing his hat to wipe his forehead. "You know I want to help, but without witnesses or proof." He gestured helplessly. "My hands are pretty much tied here. Best I can do is file a report and increase patrols in the area." Daniel stepped forward, his jaw set. "Sheriff, with all due respect, this is clearly escalating. First the diner, then the graffiti. Now this? These aren't random acts." "I understand that, Mr. Delaney. But no, I don't think you do." Daniel's voice took on the edge of authority he usually reserved for his work in D.C. "I have resources at my disposal. One phone call, and I can have a federal task force." "Son," Frank's quiet word cut through Daniel's building momentum. "That's not the answer. Not yet." Daniel turned to his father, frustration evident in every line of his face. "Dad, they're threatening your life now. We can't just—" "We can, and we will." Frank's tone was gentle but firm. "Bringing in the feds will only make things worse. These people, they feed on attention, on fear. Making this bigger only gives them what they want." The sheriff nodded slowly. Frank's got a point. Sometimes a show of force just adds fuel to the fire. Daniel paced the driveway, running a hand through his hair. "So we just wait until they actually hurt you? Is that the plan?" Frank placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. "No. We stay vigilant, but we don't let them drive us to extremes. I've seen what happens when fear takes the wheel, son. It never leads anywhere good." The morning wore on as they filed reports and arranged for a tow truck. Frank's neighbor, Bill Matthews, offered to loan him his spare car until the truck could be repaired. The community was already rallying around him, just as they had after the diner incident. By late afternoon, Frank felt the weight of the day's events settling into his bones. He needed peace, needed to center himself. As evening approached, he made his decision. "I'm going to church," he announced to Daniel, who had spent the day making calls and pacing the house like a caged lion. "Dad, after everything today, especially after everything today." Frank straightened his tie in the hallway mirror. "Wednesday evening service always helps clear my head." Daniel insisted on driving him in the borrowed car. The small Methodist church looked exactly as it had for the past 40 years, its white steeple reaching toward the darkening sky. The familiar sight alone helped ease some of Frank's tension. Inside, the evening service was intimate, just 20 or so regular attendees. Word of the morning's events had already spread, and Frank found himself surrounded by concerned faces and gentle touches to his shoulder. Pastor Roberts adjusted his sermon to include a special prayer for protection and wisdom in times of trial. "Lord," the pastor's voice carried through the quiet sanctuary, "we lift up our brother Frank. Grant him strength in the face of adversity, and help us all remember that love conquers hate, that light always overcomes darkness." "Amen," the congregation responded in unison. As the service ended, Frank felt somewhat lighter. The prayers and support of his church family had restored some of his peace, reminded him that he wasn't facing this alone. He stood chatting with Mrs. Henderson about her famous apple pies when something caught his eye through the church's front window. There, across the street, partially hidden behind an old oak tree, stood the bully from the diner. Even in the growing darkness, Frank could make out the smirk on his face. Their eyes met through the glass, and the younger man's smile widened. He made no move to leave or hide. This was a deliberate show of force, a message that nowhere was truly safe. Frank felt his shoulders tense, but he forced himself to turn back to Mrs. Henderson's conversation. He wouldn't give his tormentor the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Still, the weight of that watching presence settled over him like a shadow, dimming the peace he'd found during the service. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Frank's weathered porch as he sat in his favorite rocking chair, his shoulders slumped with the weight of recent events. His old dog Rusty lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to nuzzle Frank's hand, sensing his master's distress. Frank's worn fingers traced the grain of the wooden armrest, his mind heavy with thoughts of defeat. The harassment had taken its toll. The slashed tires, the threatening notes, the constant feeling of being watched. Even the simple pleasure of his morning coffee at the diner had become tainted with whispers and sideways glances. "Maybe it's time to sell," he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. Rusty's ears perked up at the sound, and the old dog gave a soft whine. The sun was beginning to set when Frank noticed the first few cars pulling up along his street. His body tensed, years of military training kicking in as he prepared for the worst. But then he saw something unusual. People were stepping out of their vehicles, carrying candles. Mrs. Thompson from the grocery store emerged from her station wagon, carefully shielding a flame with her hand. Behind her, the Peterson family walked up his sidewalk, their young children clutching electric tea lights. More cars arrived, and more neighbors appeared, each bearing their own light. Frank's breath caught in his throat as Sarah stepped forward from the growing crowd. She wore her diner uniform, having come straight from her shift, and carried a large pillar candle that flickered in the evening breeze. "What's all this?" Frank called out, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah's warm smile lit up her face as she approached the porch steps.
"We wanted to show you something, Mr. Delaney. You're not alone. Not now. Not ever."
As if on cue, more people appeared from every direction. The hardware store owner, the local school teacher, faces Frank recognized from church, and others he'd seen around town but never spoken to. They formed a semicircle around his front yard, their lights creating a gentle glow in the growing dusk. Frank's hands gripped the armrests of his chair as he watched the gathering crowd. His chest felt tight, and he blinked rapidly against the moisture forming in his eyes. Reverend Williams stepped forward, his kind face illuminated by candlelight. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," he began to sing, his deep voice carrying clearly through the evening air. One by one, others joined in, their voices rising in harmony. The hymn wrapped around Frank like a warm embrace, carrying him back to Sunday services with his late wife, to quiet moments of peace during the war, to times when faith had carried him through the darkest nights. "That saved a wretch like me," the voices continued, and Frank noticed Daniel standing at the edge of the crowd, having slipped in unnoticed. His son's eyes shone with pride and love. Sarah stepped onto the porch, placing her candle on the small table beside Frank. "You stood up for me when others wouldn't," she said softly. "You showed me what real courage looks like. Now it's our turn to stand up for you." Mr. Carter, the diner manager, cleared his throat. "Frank, you've been coming to my place for 15 years. Never caused trouble. Always treated everyone with respect. What you did that day, standing up to that bully, that's who you are. That's who we all should be. That. The hymn faded, and Mrs. Thompson spoke next, her voice carrying across the yard. "My Tommy," she said, gesturing to her teenage son. "He asked me why people were being mean to Mr. Delaney. I told him it's because some folks are scared of good men who stand up for what's right. But we're not scared, are we, Tommy?" The boy shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. Mr. Delaney's a hero." Frank's vision blurred completely as tears spilled down his weathered cheeks. His hands trembled as he reached up to wipe them away, but they kept coming. Years of holding everything inside, the pain of losing his wife, the memories of war, the recent harassment, it all broke free in that moment of pure love from his community. "Greater love hath no man than this," Reverend Williams quoted, "that a man lay down his life for his friends." John 15:13. He smiled gently at Frank. "You've been laying down your life for others since Vietnam, Frank. You're still doing it today." The crowd murmured in agreement, and someone started another hymn. "This Little Light of Mine" floated through the evening air, children's voices mixing with adults, creating a tapestry of sound that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness. Sarah placed a gentle hand on Frank's shoulder. "We're not going anywhere, Mr. Delaney. Those bullies think they can scare us into silence, but they don't know this community. They don't know you." Frank tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He looked out at the sea of familiar faces, all illuminated by candlelight, all there for him. The Peterson kids were swaying to the music, their electric candles dancing. Old Mr. Jenkins, who barely left his house anymore, stood supported by his daughter. Even Deputy Wilson had shown up, still in his uniform, singing along with everyone else. The light from all those candles seemed to push away the shadows that had been haunting Frank's days. Each flame represented a person who cared, who saw his worth, who stood with him against the darkness. Daniel made his way through the crowd and up onto the porch. He stood beside his father's chair, a protective presence that reminded Frank of all the times he'd stood watch over Daniel's bed when he was sick as a child. Now their roles were reversed, and his son's strength helped hold him together as emotions overwhelmed him. "I never wanted recognition," Frank managed to say, his voice thick with tears. "Never wanted to cause trouble." "You didn't cause anything," Sarah assured him firmly. "You stood up for what's right. That's what we're doing now." The singing continued as the sky darkened completely, but the gathering showed no signs of dispersing. Children ran with their lights, creating patterns in the darkness. Adults chatted in small groups, sharing stories about Frank's kindness over the years. It felt like a celebration of everything good in their small town, a reminder that love could overcome hate. Daniel squeezed his father's shoulder and leaned down close to his ear. "See, Dad? You are not forgotten." The morning after the vigil dawned crisp and clear, with dewdrops sparkling on Frank's garden like tiny diamonds. He sat on his front porch, breathing in the fresh air, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Daniel occupied the rocking chair beside him, and for the first time in days, a sense of peace settled over them both. "Those folks last night," Frank said softly, shaking his head in wonder. "I never expected anything like that." Daniel smiled, taking a sip from his own mug. "That's what community looks like, Dad. Real community." The morning sun warmed their faces as they watched a pair of cardinals flit between the old maple trees. Rusty dozed contentedly at Frank's feet, occasionally twitching in his sleep. The peaceful moment felt like a balm after days of tension. "You know," Frank mused, "your mother would have loved seeing all those people out there. She always said kindness was contagious." "She was right about that," Daniel agreed, his voice gentle. "Just like she was right about most things." Frank nodded, memories of his late wife bringing a slight smile to his face. The way Sarah organized everyone, bringing those candles, the hymns. He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "Makes a man feel blessed, despite everything else." "I think those troublemakers will think twice now," Daniel said, stretching his legs out. "Nothing like a united community to send a message." The morning air was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. Birds sang in the distance. And somewhere down the road, a neighbor's rooster announced the day. Frank felt his shoulders finally beginning to relax after days of carrying invisible weight. Maybe you're right, son. Maybe the worst is behind us now. The words had barely left his mouth when a deafening crash shattered the morning peace. Both men jerked to their feet, coffee cups clattering to the porch floor. In the driveway, Frank's old pickup truck erupted in flames, the heat visible even from where they stood. "No!" Frank shouted, already moving. Daniel grabbed his arm, but Frank shook him off, running toward the burning vehicle. The flames licked higher, feeding on the gasoline that had clearly been poured over the truck. Black smoke billowed into the crystal-clear morning sky. The heat was intense, making it hard to get close. "Dad, wait!" Daniel called out, racing after his father. Frank reached the garden hose, yanking it toward the truck. His hands shook as he turned the spigot. But the thin stream of water seemed pitiful against the inferno. The smoke was thick now, rolling across the yard in heavy waves. "We need to back up," Daniel shouted, coughing. "The fire department's on their way." But Frank wouldn't retreat. He kept trying to fight the flames, even as the smoke enveloped him. His eyes burned. His lungs screamed for clean air. But all he could think about was the truck, the last vehicle he and his wife had bought together, the one he'd taught Daniel to drive in. "Can't let it." Frank's words dissolved into violent coughing. The smoke was too thick, too acrid. His legs began to wobble, and the world started to tilt sideways. Daniel saw his father stumble. Without hesitation, he rushed forward into the smoke, grabbed Frank around the waist, and dragged him backward, away from the inferno. Frank tried to resist, but his strength was gone. His coughing turned desperate, each breath a struggle. "Help's coming, Dad," Daniel said, lowering Frank onto the grass a safe distance away. "Just breathe. Try to breathe." In the distance, sirens wailed. Frank could barely hear them over his own harsh coughing. His chest felt like it was on fire, each breath more difficult than the last. Through watering eyes, he watched his beloved truck burn, helpless to stop it. Rusty barked frantically from the porch, but Daniel had him confined behind the screen door, keeping him safe. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Someone brought a blanket, which Daniel wrapped around his father's shoulders. The fire trucks arrived in a screech of brakes and flashing lights. Firefighters jumped into action, unrolling hoses and shouting commands. But even as they began to battle the blaze, it was clear the truck was already a total loss. Frank's coughing grew worse. Each breath wheezed in his chest, and his face had taken on an alarming gray pallor. Daniel held his father's hand, watching with increasing concern as Frank struggled for air. "We need paramedics here," Daniel shouted, his commanding voice cutting through the chaos. The emergency response team, already on scene with the fire trucks, rushed over with their equipment. "Sir, can you hear me?" one of the paramedics asked, kneeling beside Frank. They quickly placed an oxygen mask over his face, but Frank continued to struggle, his body racked with coughing spasms. "He inhaled a lot of smoke," Daniel explained, his voice tight with worry. He was too close to the fire. The paramedics worked efficiently, checking Frank's vital signs and listening to his labored breathing. Their expressions grew serious as they performed their assessment. "We need to transport him," the lead paramedic declared. "His oxygen levels are too low, and there's significant smoke inhalation." As they helped Frank onto the stretcher, he tried to speak through the oxygen mask, his eyes fixed on the smoldering remains of his truck. Daniel leaned close to hear him. "The pictures," Frank managed between coughs, "in the glove box?" Daniel's heart clenched, understanding immediately. The family photos his father always kept in the truck, including the last picture taken of their mother, were now nothing but ashes. The paramedics loaded Frank into the ambulance, his coughing still violent and uncontrolled. Daniel watched as his father, who had always seemed so strong and unshakable, lay vulnerable on the stretcher, fighting for each breath. "I'm right behind you, Dad," Daniel called out as they closed the ambulance doors. The siren started up again, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving Daniel standing in the yard amid the chaos of fire trucks, curious neighbors, and the acrid smell of smoke. The morning that had started so peacefully had turned into a nightmare. As Daniel hurried to his car to follow the ambulance, he caught sight of a vehicle speeding away down a side street, a familiar truck with a distinctive dent in its fender. His jaw clenched, but his priority was clear. His father needed him now. Justice would have to wait. The steady beep of the heart monitor pulled Frank from a fitful sleep. His throat felt raw, like he'd swallowed sandpaper, and the sterile hospital air made his nose twitch. As his eyes adjusted to the fluorescent lighting, he found Daniel sitting beside his bed, shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but eyes alert and watchful. "Hey, Dad," Daniel said softly, leaning forward. "How are you feeling?" Frank tried to speak, but only managed a raspy cough. Daniel quickly reached for a cup of water with a straw, helping his father take small sips. The cool liquid brought blessed relief to his parched throat. "I'm sorry, son," Frank finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "All this trouble. You should be in Washington, doing your job, not babysitting your old man." Daniel's face tightened. Don't you dare apologize. But look at me." Frank gestured weakly at the IV lines and monitoring equipment surrounding him. "Couldn't even put out a simple car fire without ending up here. Worlds passed me by, Danny. Maybe it's time I accepted that." "The world hasn't passed you by," Daniel said firmly, gripping his father's hand. "Those people who came to support you last night? They're proof of that. You fought for what was right in Vietnam, and you're still fighting for what's right today. That will never go out of style, Dad." Frank turned his head toward the window, blinking rapidly against the moisture in his eyes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital room floor, reminding him of another morning, decades ago, when he'd watched shadows stretch across rice paddies while carrying a wounded buddy to safety. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his memories. Sarah stood in the doorway, holding a bouquet of bright yellow daisies. Behind her, several familiar faces from town peeked in. Mrs. Thompson from the church choir, Mr. Rodriguez from the hardware store, and even old Bill Jenkins, who ran the local garage. "Is it okay if we come in?" Sarah asked softly. Frank felt his cheeks warm with embarrassment at being seen in this vulnerable state, but Daniel answered for him. "Of course, please come in." They filed in quietly, creating a semicircle around his bed. Sarah placed the flowers on his bedside table, their cheerful faces a stark contrast to the clinical white walls. "We've been praying for you, Frank," Mrs. Thompson said, her kind eyes filled with concern. The whole congregation had a special prayer meeting this morning. Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward, his usually jovial face serious. "My wife sent some of her special chicken soup. She says it'll help clear out those lungs better than any medicine." Frank felt a complicated mix of emotions surge through him: gratitude for their kindness, shame at needing their help, and a deep, aching sadness that his simple stand against cruelty had led to this. He'd faced enemy fire without flinching, but this outpouring of love and support made him feel raw and exposed. "I don't know what to say," he managed, his voice still rough. "You shouldn't have gone to all this trouble." "Trouble?" Bill Jenkins scoffed good-naturedly. "After all the times you've helped others? Remember when my tow truck broke down in that snowstorm last winter? You were out there with me for hours, helping me fix it in the freezing cold. Never asked for a thing in return." Sarah perched carefully on the edge of his bed. "And how many times have you stepped in when customers got rowdy at the diner? Long before that man showed up. You've always looked out for all of us, Frank. Now it's our turn to look out for you." Frank felt his throat tighten, not from the smoke this time, but from emotion. He'd spent so many years trying to be strong, to stand on his own, that accepting help felt almost like admitting defeat. But looking at these faces, these good people who'd taken time from their day to visit him, he realized that maybe strength sometimes meant letting others in. The visitors stayed for about an hour, sharing stories and words of encouragement. Frank found himself drifting in and out, the medication making him drowsy. but their presence wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Even in his semi-conscious state, he could feel Daniel's steady presence beside him, a silent guardian. As evening approached, the visitors gradually said their goodbyes, each promising to return. Sarah was the last to leave, squeezing his hand gently before she went. "Get some rest, Frank. We need our hero back at the diner." After they'd gone, Frank dozed fitfully while Daniel maintained his vigil. Through half-closed eyes, Frank watched his son, this boy who'd grown into such a powerful man, yet still looked at him with such love and respect. When he thought Frank was asleep, Daniel pulled out his phone and moved to the corner of the room. His voice was low but clear in the quiet space as he dialed a number. "Jim? It's Daniel Delaney." "Yes. I know what time it is in D.C. Listen. About that situation we discussed. It's time." Frank kept his eyes closed, pretending to sleep, but his heart ached. He'd never wanted his son to fight his battles for him. Yet here they were, the roles reversed, the protector now protected. As he drifted off to real sleep, Frank wondered if perhaps this was what family truly meant. Not just the strength to stand alone, but the courage to let others stand with you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Frank's front yard as Daniel's government-issued SUV pulled into the driveway. Frank sat in the passenger's seat, his hospital discharge papers tucked into the pocket of his worn denim jacket. His breathing was better, but occasional coughs still rattled his chest. As they approached the house, Frank noticed subtle changes. Small cameras had been discreetly mounted under the eaves, and a black van was parked down the street. Too clean and too new to belong to any of his neighbors. His keen veteran's eye picked up other details. Positions that offered clear sight lines of his property. Spots where agents could maintain watch without being obvious. "Your people have been busy," Frank said quietly, nodding toward a barely visible sensor near his front door. Daniel helped his father from the car, supporting him with a gentle but firm grip. "Had to make sure you'd be safe coming home. The team's been here since yesterday." Inside, the farmhouse smelled of fresh coffee and cleaning supplies. Someone had tidied up while they were gone, erasing all traces of smoke from the truck fire. Rusty, his old dog, came trotting up, tail wagging furiously at their return. Frank scratched behind the dog's ears, finding comfort in the familiar gesture. "Sit down, Dad," Daniel said, guiding him to his favorite armchair. "We need to talk." Frank settled into the worn leather, his body still aching from the hospital stay. Daniel poured them both coffee from a fresh pot before taking a seat across from him. The afternoon light streaming through the window highlighted the worry lines on his son's face. "While you were recovering, we did some digging," Daniel began, his voice taking on the professional tone Frank recognized from his rare TV appearances. "The man who attacked you at the diner. He's not just some random troublemaker." Frank wrapped his hands around the warm coffee mug. "Figured as much. Man like that, full of that much hate, usually has connections." "More than connections," Daniel continued. "He's part of a larger organization we've been monitoring for months. A hate group that's been gaining traction in several states, responsible for numerous attacks on minorities and veterans." Frank's fingers tightened around his mug. "Veterans?" "They target those they see as race traitors. Veterans who fought alongside minorities. People who stand up against discrimination." Daniel pulled out his phone, showing Frank several surveillance photos. "They've been watching you since before the diner incident. You weren't randomly chosen." The realization hit Frank like a physical blow. All those times he'd felt watched, the headlights in the night, the escalating threats, it hadn't been just local harassment. He'd stumbled into something much bigger. "How long have you known?" Frank asked, his voice rough. "We suspected after the graffiti, but couldn't be certain until the truck fire. The accelerant they used matched other cases we've been investigating." Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Dad, these people are serious. They've committed acts of violence across 3 states. The diner was just their way of testing you, seeing how you'd react." Frank absorbed this information, memories of Vietnam surfacing, how the enemy would probe defenses, testing for weaknesses before striking. Some things never changed, whether in jungles or small towns. The surveillance team has identified at least 4 members operating in the area, Daniel continued. We've been gathering evidence, building a case. The attack on you might actually help us bring down their entire network. A sudden movement outside caught Frank's attention. Through the window, he watched 2 plainclothes agents doing a perimeter check, their movements casual but purposeful. His home had become a tactical operation, and somehow he'd become central to a federal investigation. Your mother would laugh at all this fuss, Frank said softly, a sad smile touching his lips. Remember how she always said I had a knack for finding trouble? Daniel's professional demeanor cracked slightly. She also said you had a knack for standing up to it. That's what I learned from both of you. Standing up matters, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Frank pushed himself up from the chair, moving slowly to the window. The charred remains of his pickup truck had been towed away, leaving only a dark stain on the gravel driveway. That truck had been with him for 20 years. Fishing trips with Daniel, hauling supplies for neighbors, quiet drives when memories of the war got too loud. They thought burning my truck would break me, Frank said, his voice growing stronger, despite its raspiness. Thought they could scare an old veteran into silence. He turned to face his son, standing straighter, despite the lingering pain in his chest. They may have burned my truck, but they'll never burn my spirit. The words hung in the air between father and son, carrying the weight of all they'd been through, not just these past days, but the years of quiet strength, of standing up for what was right, of passing these values from one generation to the next. Daniel stood and joined his father at the window. Outside, the surveillance team continued their quiet work, protecting this small farmhouse that had become an unexpected battleground in a larger fight against hatred and intolerance. Frank sat at his kitchen table early that morning, watching Daniel gather his things. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. His son moved with purpose, checking his phone and adjusting his shoulder holster with practiced efficiency. You sure you'll be okay here alone? Daniel asked. His forehead creased with worry. Frank managed a small smile. Son, I've been taking care of myself longer than you've been alive. He glanced out the window where an unmarked car sat discreetly down the street. Besides, I'm not really alone, am I? Daniel paused, his hand on the doorknob. They're the best agents I have. Just stay inside today, okay? Please? Frank nodded, though it pained him to feel like a prisoner in his own home. After Daniel left, he settled into his familiar routine as best he could. He made another cup of coffee, fed Rusty, and tried to ignore the dull ache in his chest from the smoke inhalation. Across town, in a dingy basement, the bully paced back and forth. 3 other men lounged on mismatched furniture, watching him with varying degrees of interest. Empty beer cans littered the floor, and cigarette smoke hung thick in the air. That old man made us look weak, the bully spat, kicking an empty can. Everyone in town's treating him like some kind of hero now. One of his companions, a heavy-set man with a patchy beard, leaned forward. So what's the plan? Another message? The bully's face twisted into an ugly smile. Messages ain't enough anymore. Tonight, we show everyone what happens when they stand against us. None of them noticed the van parked 2 blocks away, filled with surveillance equipment, or the satellite dish disguised as a TV antenna on the neighbor's roof. In his temporary command center at the local sheriff's office, Daniel studied multiple screens showing different camera feeds. His jaw clenched as he listened to the audio transmission from the basement meeting. Sheriff Thompson stood beside him, shaking his head. Never thought we had something this organized in our town. These boys always seemed like regular troublemakers. Not this. Daniel's fingers drummed against the desk. They're connected to a network we've been tracking for months. Hate groups, recruiting in small towns, targeting vulnerable communities. He ran a hand through his hair. But my father wasn't supposed to be involved in any of this. The surveillance continued throughout the day. Frank tried to keep busy at home, organizing old photographs and reading his worn Bible. Every so often, he'd catch glimpses of movement outside, agents switching positions, keeping watch. By late afternoon, Daniel's team had recorded hours of incriminating conversations. The group in the basement had detailed their connections to larger organizations, previous attacks, and plans for future violence. But they kept coming back to their plans for Frank. "Sir," one of Daniel's analysts approached with a tablet. "They're planning to move tonight. Multiple vehicles, possibly armed." Daniel studied the new intelligence, his expression grave. The timing wasn't ideal. They'd hoped to gather more evidence about the larger network. But the immediate threat to his father changed everything. In the basement, the bully was handing out dark clothes and masks. "Remember, we hit fast and hard. By the time anyone responds, it'll be too late." Daniel paced the command center, phone pressed to his ear, as he consulted with his superiors. In Washington, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the office windows. His team waited tensely for his decision. The choice weighed heavily on him. As head of Homeland Security, he knew the value of patience, of letting investigations play out to catch bigger targets. But as a son, watching these men plot against his father, his instincts screamed for immediate action. A young agent approached with another update. "Sir, they're loading their vehicles now." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, remembering his father's face in the hospital bed, weak from smoke inhalation. He thought of the burned truck, the hateful graffiti, the fear that had crept into their quiet lives. His phone buzzed with a message from the surveillance team. "Target group mobilizing. Request immediate instructions." Daniel looked at the faces around him, his team, the local sheriff, all waiting for his command. In that moment, he wasn't just a federal official making a tactical decision. He was a son protecting his father, a man standing against hate in all its forms. He lifted his phone, voice firm but quiet. "Do it. Bring them in tonight." The words seemed to echo in the command center. Within seconds, his team sprang into action, coordinating with local law enforcement. The machinery of justice, so long held in check, finally began to move. Through the surveillance feeds, they watched the bully and his companions climb into their vehicles, unaware that their night of planned violence would end before it began. Daniel stood straight-backed, watching the monitors, knowing that soon his father would be able to sleep peacefully again. The last light of day faded from the sky as multiple teams moved into position. In the growing darkness, justice prepared to meet hate head-on, not with matching violence, but with the full weight of law and order. The night wrapped around Frank's farmhouse like a thick blanket, broken only by the soft glow of his porch light. He sat in his old wooden rocker, a cup of lukewarm coffee growing cold in his hands. Sleep had been elusive lately, his mind too full of worries and memories. In the distance, beyond the stretch of darkened fields, the town's lights twinkled like earthbound stars. Frank's weathered hands tightened around his coffee cup as he noticed something different in the familiar nightscape. Rapid flashes of red and blue, silent at this distance, but unmistakable. His breath caught in his throat. He knew what those lights meant. Daniel had been tight-lipped about the operation's details, but a father knows his son. The determined set of Daniel's jaw earlier that day, the careful way he checked his phone every few minutes, something was coming. The lights multiplied. More patrol cars converging on what Frank knew was the abandoned Miller property at the edge of town. He'd heard whispers about that place, about the kinds of people who gathered there after dark. The bully's truck had been spotted there more than once. Frank stood slowly, his joints protesting the cool night air. From his elevated porch, he had a clear view of the unfolding operation. More lights appeared. Not just police cruisers now, but larger vehicles. Federal vehicles, his son's people. Through his old binoculars, kept handy since the troubles began, Frank watched the scene unfold like a silent movie. Dark figures moved with military precision, surrounding the property. Even from this distance, he recognized the distinctive gear of federal tactical teams. This wasn't just a local police action. This was Daniel's full force at work. Sudden brightness erupted as powerful spotlights illuminated the property. Frank could imagine the shock on the faces inside, the scrambling chaos as their dark sanctuary was exposed. He'd seen similar operations in Vietnam, though he tried not to think about those days anymore. Movement caught his eye. People running, but not escaping. The federal net was too tight, too well planned. One by one, figures were led out in handcuffs. Through his binoculars, Frank recognized the bully's swagger even in defeat. The man's arrogance seemed to deflate as he was placed in a vehicle, replaced by something Frank recognized: fear. More agents emerged from the building, carrying boxes and equipment. Evidence, Frank supposed, of whatever hatred they'd been brewing in there. He lowered his binoculars, feeling strangely hollow. This wasn't the confrontation he'd imagined during sleepless nights after the diner incident. There was no satisfaction in watching from afar as others fought his battle. But then he remembered Daniel's words from days ago. "This isn't just about you anymore, Dad. Men like that, they hurt everyone they touch. Sometimes the best way to fight is to let justice take its course." The night wore on. The lights continued to flash, but their urgency had diminished. Frank watched as vehicles began to leave one by one, taking their prisoners to face whatever consequences awaited them. He thought about Sarah at the diner, about all the others who'd suffered from their hatred. Maybe this was better. Not just justice for him, but for everyone. The eastern sky began to lighten, pale blue seeping into the darkness. Frank had dozed off in his rocker when the sound of tires on gravel roused him. Daniel's car pulled into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn mist. His son looked tired but satisfied as he climbed the porch steps. His tie was loosened, his normally pristine suit showing signs of a long night's work. Frank reached for the coffee pot he'd kept warm, pouring a fresh cup for both of them. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, father and son, watching the sun begin its slow climb above the horizon. The morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of a new day. Frank took a sip of his coffee, studying his son's face. He saw there not just the powerful federal official, but also the boy who'd always fought for what was right, who'd learned early that standing up against hatred meant sometimes getting knocked down. "So it's over?" Frank asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Daniel met his father's gaze, his expression both weary and triumphant. "Almost," he replied, wrapping his hands around the warm coffee mug. Morning sunlight cast long shadows across Frank's front yard as he and Daniel walked slowly around the blackened shell of his old pickup truck. The acrid smell of burnt metal and rubber still hung in the air, making Frank's chest tighten with each breath. He placed a weathered hand on the truck's scorched hood, remembering all the years of faithful service it had given him. "Had this old girl since you were in high school," Frank said quietly, his voice rough from the smoke inhalation. "Remember teaching you to drive stick shift in her?" Daniel nodded, his eyes soft with memory. "Yeah, Dad. I ground those gears something awful that first day." The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Tom and Martha Wilson from 2 farms over were walking up the gravel driveway, followed by several other neighbors. Martha carried a covered dish, while Tom held an envelope in his hand. "Morning, Frank," Tom called out, his usually booming voice gentler than normal. "We all got together last night after we heard what happened." More neighbors appeared: the Hendersons, the Jacobsons, old Mr. Peterson who ran the hardware store, until Frank's front yard was filled with familiar faces. Some carried food, others tools and supplies. "We can't replace everything you lost," Martha said, stepping forward, "but we wanted to help however we could." She handed Frank the covered dish, her famous apple pie. He could smell it through the foil. Tom held out the envelope. "It's not much, but everyone pitched in what they could. Should be enough to help with a down payment on another truck." Frank's hands trembled slightly as he took the envelope, overwhelmed by the gesture. "I can't accept this," he said, trying to hand it back. "Yes, you can," Mrs. Henderson spoke up from the crowd. "You've helped every one of us over the years, Frank Delaney. Now it's our turn." Daniel watched his father's face, seeing the emotion there. Frank had always been the one giving help, never asking for it, never expecting it in return. "Remember when my John was sick last winter?" Martha added. "You plowed our driveway every morning so I could get him to his treatments. Never said a word about it. Just did it because that's who you are." Mr. Peterson stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "And that time my store's roof was leaking, you climbed up there yourself, bad knee and all, to help patch it." One by one, neighbors shared their stories. Small kindnesses Frank had shown them over the years. Moments he'd probably forgotten, but they hadn't. Each memory seemed to straighten his shoulders a little more, ease the weight of recent events. "I don't know what to say," Frank managed finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't need to say anything," Tom replied. "Just let us help, like you've always helped us." The group began to disperse around the yard. Some examined the truck, discussing what parts might be salvageable. Others started cleaning up the scorched grass and debris. A few women set up an impromptu food station on Frank's porch, laying out casseroles and comfort food. Daniel squeezed his father's shoulder. "This is what community looks like, Dad. This is what you help build. One kind act at a time." Frank nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He watched his neighbors working together, their quiet determination to help healing something deep inside him that the hatred had wounded. The sound of tires on gravel announced another arrival. Sarah's familiar compact car pulled up, and she hurried over to where Frank and Daniel stood. "I can't stay long. Got to get back to the diner," she said, slightly out of breath. "But I had to tell you something, Mr. Delaney." Frank smiled warmly at the young waitress who'd shown such courage through everything. "What's that, Sarah?" Her eyes sparkled with excitement. "Well, Mr. Carter and I were talking this morning, and we want to host a special breakfast at the diner. In your honor." Frank started to protest, but Sarah held up her hand. "No arguments. The whole town wants to come together and celebrate you properly. Show those bullies that hate doesn't win here. Love does." Daniel watched his father's face carefully, seeing the mix of emotions there: embarrassment, gratitude, and finally, acceptance. "That's awful kind of you all," Frank said softly. "It's decided then." Sarah beamed. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock sharp, the whole town will be there." She gave Frank a quick hug, nodded to Daniel, and hurried back to her car. Frank stood quietly for a moment, watching his neighbors work, holding Martha's pie in one hand and the envelope in the other. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, and Daniel saw something in his father's face he hadn't seen in a long time: peace. "You okay, Dad?" Daniel asked softly. Frank looked around at the people who'd come to help him, these neighbors who'd become family over the years. His voice was steady when he answered. "You know, son, I think I am. Sometimes it takes the darkness to show you how much light there really is." The morning breeze carried the sweet scent of fresh paint as Daniel and his father stood in front of the vandalized fence. Several neighbors had already gathered, carrying paintbrushes, sandpaper, and cans of white paint. Frank's weathered hands trembled slightly as he gripped a paint roller. "Dad, let me handle the heavy lifting," Daniel said softly, taking the roller from his father's hands. "You can supervise. Make sure we do it right." Frank nodded, his eyes misting as he watched more trucks pull into his driveway. Mr. Carter, from the diner, stepped out of his pickup, toolbox in hand. Sarah followed in her small sedan, bringing coffee and fresh pastries for everyone. "This is too much," Frank whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "No, Mr. Delaney, it's not enough," Sarah said, pressing a warm cup of coffee into his hands. "After everything you've done for us, standing up when others wouldn't, this is the least we can do." Rusty, Frank's old golden retriever, wandered among the volunteers, tail wagging as he received pets and the occasional treat. The old dog seemed to sense the positive energy in the air, staying close to Frank's side when he wasn't making his rounds. The morning progressed with the steady rhythm of work. Daniel and 2 other men carefully removed the hateful graffiti with sanders, while others prepared the surface for new paint. The sound of cheerful conversation mixed with the scraping of tools and the soft swoosh of paint rollers. Frank watched from his porch rocker, Rusty dozing at his feet. Each stroke of white paint felt like an act of healing, covering the ugly marks of hatred with the clean slate of community love. His eyes tracked Daniel's movements. His son's powerful frame bent to the task, just like any other volunteer. No hint of his high-ranking position visible in his humble work. "Frank," called Mrs. Peterson from next door. "I brought over some of my famous lemonade. You need to keep your strength up." She carried a tray loaded with glasses, ice tinkling invitingly in the morning warmth. As the volunteers took a break, clustering around the porch steps with their drinks, Frank felt something shift inside his chest. The wall he'd built around his heart after returning from Vietnam, reinforced by years of subtle discrimination and painful memories, began to crack. "Remember when you first moved here, Frank?" Mr. Carter asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Must have been, what, 30 years ago?" Frank nodded. 32, right after Margaret passed. Needed a fresh start. "Well," Mr. Carter continued, "I recall thinking you were the quietest neighbor we'd ever had. Kept to yourself. Always polite, but distant. Now I understand why." He gestured to the fence. "But this here shows you're not alone anymore. Should have never been alone in the first place." Sarah organized the lunch break, spreading out homemade sandwiches and potato salad on folding tables in the yard. The scene reminded Frank of church picnics from his childhood. Before the war, before the pain. When community meant something simple and pure. As afternoon approached, more townspeople arrived. The sheriff's deputy brought his pressure washer to clean the driveway. The local hardware store owner showed up with supplies to repair Frank's mailbox, which had been damaged during the truck fire. Even the town's young pastor came, rolling up his sleeves to help paint. Daniel worked tirelessly, moving from task to task, organizing the efforts with the same quiet efficiency he brought to his work in Washington. But Frank noticed the softness in his son's eyes, the way he seemed more at peace here among neighbors than in the corridors of power. "Your boy's something special," Mrs. Peterson said, settling next to Frank on the porch. "Takes after his daddy that way." Frank watched as Daniel helped a younger volunteer properly angle a paint roller. "He's better than me," Frank said quietly. "Stronger, wiser." "Now don't you start that, Mrs. Peterson scolded gently. "That boy learned everything important from you. We all see it. The way he carries himself, his kindness, his integrity. That's your doing, Frank Delaney." As the afternoon wore on, the transformation became complete. The fence gleamed with fresh paint. The mailbox stood straight and proud, and the driveway sparkled clean. But it was more than physical repairs. Frank felt something deeper being restored. When Sarah approached him with news about the breakfast in his honor, Frank initially protested. "I'm not one for speeches," he mumbled. "Just a few words," she insisted. "People need to hear from you, Mr. Delaney. Your voice matters more than you know." As twilight approached and the last of the volunteers headed home, Frank sat in his favorite chair by the window. A small notepad rested on his knee as he practiced what he might say at the breakfast. Rusty lay beside him, his tail thumping steadily against the floor, offering silent encouragement. "Thank you seems too simple," Frank said to his faithful companion. "How do you tell people they've given you back your faith in humanity?" Rusty's brown eyes watched him steadily, filled with unconditional love. The old dog had been with him through countless lonely nights, and now he was here to witness this unexpected blessing. Frank looked out at his restored property. The fresh paint glowing in the fading light, the clean driveway, the repaired mailbox. But more than the physical repairs, he saw the fingerprints of love left by his neighbors. Every brushstroke, every nail hammered, every moment spent under the hot sun represented a person who cared. His hands shook slightly as he looked down at his notepad, trying to find the right words to express his gratitude. Rusty pressed closer to his leg, offering comfort as he always did when he sensed Frank's emotion. The old veteran reached down to scratch behind his dog's ears, drawing strength from the simple gesture. Through his window, Frank could see Daniel on the porch, making one final check of their day's work. His son's silhouette reminded him of all the years they'd stood together, father and son against the world. Now, Somehow, the world had changed. Or perhaps, Frank realized, he was finally seeing it clearly again through eyes washed clean by unexpected kindness. The bell above the diner's door chimed steadily as people filed in, filling every booth and counter seat. The usual morning coffee crowd had multiplied tenfold, with faces both familiar and new pressing shoulder to shoulder in the warm space. Above the counter, a hand-painted banner, in bright blue letters, proclaimed, "Thank you, Frank," with little stars dotted around the edges. Frank Delaney stood just inside the entrance, his weathered hands fidgeting with his tie. Daniel placed a steady hand on his father's shoulder, guiding him through the crowd that parted respectfully. The applause started softly, then built until it filled the small diner with a thunderous welcome. "I don't deserve all this fuss," Frank muttered, his voice thick with emotion.
"Yes, you do, Mr. Delaney,"
Sarah called out, appearing beside them in her familiar blue uniform. Her smile was bright as sunshine as she led them to a special table at the front. "You stood up when others wouldn't. That matters more than you know." The morning light streamed through freshly cleaned windows, catching the silver in Frank's hair. His son helped him into his seat, and Sarah brought over a steaming cup of coffee, served in Frank's familiar brown mug that she'd kept aside just for him all these years. "Folks," Sarah addressed the crowd, her voice carrying clear and strong, "we're here today because one man reminded us what courage looks like." She turned to Frank, her eyes glistening. "When that bully came in spouting hate, you didn't look away. You didn't pretend it wasn't happening. You stood up, knowing what it might cost you." The diner fell silent, remembering that morning. "And it did cost you," Sarah continued, her voice softening. "But you showed us something important. That one person standing up for what's right can change everything." From the crowd, Mr. Carter, the diner manager, stepped forward. "Frank's been coming here for 20 years, he said, adjusting his glasses. "Always quiet, always kind. But that morning, we all saw the warrior's heart beneath that gentle exterior." Others began to share their stories. Mrs. Peterson from the library spoke about how Frank had helped her grandson stand up to bullies at school. Tom from the hardware store recalled how Frank had quietly paid for a struggling family's winter heating repair without wanting recognition. "My daddy fought in Vietnam too," a young man Frank didn't recognize said from the back. "He didn't make it home, but seeing you stand tall, sir, it helps me picture how he might have been." Frank gripped his coffee mug tighter, fighting back tears. Daniel squeezed his father's shoulder, his own eyes moist. Sarah returned to the front holding up a small wooden box. "We took up a collection," she explained, placing it before Frank. "Not for charity, you'd never accept that, but to replace your truck." Frank started to protest, but Sarah held up her hand. The whole town contributed. Even folks from Milton and Riverside sent something when they heard the story. Because what happened to you wasn't just about one man or one moment. It was about all of us. The box was heavy with cash and checks, but it wasn't the money that made Frank's hands tremble as he opened it. It was the cards, dozens of them, from children and adults alike, thanking him, calling him their hero, sharing their own stories of finding courage through his example. Frank's voice caught. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I need to say something, if that's all right." The room hushed as Frank slowly stood, his military bearing evident despite his age. He looked around the packed diner, meeting the eyes of friends and strangers alike. "When I came back from Vietnam," he began, his voice low but steady, "this country wasn't always kind to its veterans. Some days, it felt like nobody remembered what we'd fought for." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But standing here now, looking at all of you, I finally understand something important." Frank gestured to the faces around him. This right here, is what we fought for. Not just freedom, but the chance to stand together, to protect each other, to say no to hate, and yes to love." His voice grew stronger. "What happened in this diner wasn't about me being brave. It was about remembering that every one of us has a choice. every single day. We can turn away, or we can stand up. We can let fear win, or we can choose faith. Faith in each other, faith in goodness, faith in the power of simple acts of kindness. Tears flowed freely now throughout the room, but Frank stood straighter. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who's lived long enough to know that silence in the face of cruelty is its own kind of violence. And I've seen enough violence in my life. He looked at Sarah, then at his son, then back at the crowd. But I've also seen enough love to know that it always wins in the end. Always. Sometimes it takes longer than we'd like. Sometimes it costs more than we think we can bear. But love wins. Frank gestured to the banner above. So thank you. Not for this celebration, but for proving that love is still stronger than hate. That community still matters. That standing together still means something in this world. The diner erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks as she hugged Frank. Daniel stood proud beside his father, no longer the powerful head of Homeland Security, but simply a son watching his father's quiet dignity touch hearts and change lives. The morning sun streamed through the windows, warming the room filled with laughter, tears, and the sweet smell of coffee and fresh-baked pies. In this moment, the diner was more than just a local eatery. It was a sanctuary of hope, a testament to the enduring power of courage, compassion, and community. The stars twinkled overhead like scattered diamonds as Frank and Daniel left the warmth of the diner. Their footsteps fell in sync on the quiet sidewalk, the sound of celebration still echoing behind them. The night air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of late summer flowers from nearby gardens. Frank's chest felt full, not just from Sarah's famous apple pie, but from the overwhelming love shown by his community. His weathered hands were still warm from all the handshakes and embraces. He touched his chest pocket, where dozens of thank you notes now rested. Want to take the long way home, Dad? Daniel asked, gesturing toward the park path that wound through the heart of town. Frank nodded, grateful for the chance to stretch his legs and clear his head. Been a while since we walked this way together. They passed the old gazebo, where Daniel had played as a child, its white paint gleaming under the moonlight. The familiar crunch of gravel under their shoes brought back memories of countless evening walks when Daniel was just a boy full of questions about life and war and everything in between. Remember how you used to bring your toy soldiers here? Frank asked, smiling at the memory. Daniel chuckled. Yeah, and you'd help me set up elaborate battles, but you always made sure to teach me something important afterward. That so? You'd say, son, these are just toys. But real soldiers fight for something bigger than themselves. They fight for what's right. Daniel's voice grew soft. I never forgot that. They paused at a wooden bench overlooking the town square. Frank eased himself down, his joints creaking slightly. Daniel joined him, both men taking in the peaceful scene before them. You know, Dad, Daniel began, his voice carrying the weight of long-held thoughts. I've never told you this, but everything I am today, my position, my principles, the way I lead, it all comes from you. Frank turned to look at his son, surprised by the sudden confession. The streetlight caught the silver in Daniel's hair, reminding Frank how quickly time had passed. The courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. The honesty to face tough truths. The importance of protecting those who can't protect themselves. Daniel's words came steadier now, like a dam finally breaking. I learned it all watching you, long before that day in the diner. Frank felt his throat tighten. He remembered the lonely years after Vietnam, raising Daniel alone, wondering if he was doing enough, being enough. You never backed down from what was right, Daniel continued. Even when it cost you. Remember Mrs. Rodriguez's grocery store? When those kids were harassing her? Frank nodded. Just did what needed doing. You did more than that, Dad. You showed me what real strength looks like. Not the kind that throws punches, but the kind that stands firm in the face of wrong. The kind that protects others. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of crickets. Frank watched a fallen leaf dance across the path, thinking about his son's words. "I see it every day in my work," Daniel said, leaning forward slightly. "The decisions I make, the way I handle crises. I always find myself thinking, what would Dad do?" "Because you taught me that true protection isn't just about force or authority. It's about heart." Frank felt tears gathering in his eyes. He blinked them back, overwhelmed by his son's words. All those years of doubt, wondering if he'd done right by his boy after losing his wife so young. They seemed to fade away under the weight of Daniel's confession. "When I was young," Daniel continued, his voice thick with emotion, "I used to think you were invincible. Not because you were the strongest or the loudest, but because you never let fear stop you from doing what was right. That's the kind of strength I've tried to bring to my own work." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, letting the words settle between them. A distant train whistle echoed through the valley, a lonely sound that seemed to underscore the intimacy of their conversation. Daniel turned to face his father fully. "You protect hearts, Dad. I protect borders. We're not so different." The words hung in the night air, simple but profound. Frank felt his chest swell with pride and love for his son. This man who had taken the simple lessons of a small-town veteran and applied them to protecting an entire nation. The same stars that had watched over Frank in Vietnam now twinkled above father and son, bearing witness to this moment of deep understanding between them. The bench creaked slightly as they sat together. Two generations of protectors, each serving in their own way, both guided by the same unwavering moral compass. The late autumn sunshine cast long shadows across Frank's driveway as he eased the shiny blue pickup truck into its spot beside the house. The vehicle, a generous gift from the community, still made him shake his head in wonder whenever he looked at it. It was newer than anything he'd ever owned, with far fewer miles than his old burned-out truck had carried. Sarah had been the one to organize the donation drive, quietly collecting funds from folks all around town. When they'd presented him with the keys 3 weeks ago, Frank had tried to refuse, but Daniel had squeezed his shoulder and whispered, "Let them show their love, Dad." As Frank climbed out of the truck, Rusty came trotting around the corner of the house, tail wagging. The old dog had gotten more spirited lately, as if he could sense the change in the air around the farmhouse. The darkness that had crept in during those troubled times had lifted, replaced by something warmer, more hopeful. "Hey there, old friend," Frank said, reaching down to scratch behind Rusty's ears. The morning dew still clung to the grass, and the garden he'd tended through all the trouble was thriving. His tomatoes were the talk of the neighborhood now, and he'd taken to sharing them with Sarah at the diner. The diner. It had become an even more special place to him now. Every morning, he'd walk in to find Sarah's bright smile waiting, along with his usual coffee and sometimes a slice of pie on the house. The other regulars would wave him over to their tables, eager to share stories or simply sit in comfortable companionship. Just yesterday, Mrs. Henderson from the church had asked him to speak to their youth group about standing up for what's right. The idea made him nervous, but he'd agreed. The same quiet strength that had helped him face down hatred now gave him courage to share his story. Frank made his way inside to change clothes for his afternoon shift at the community center where he'd started volunteering. Working with local veterans had given him a new sense of purpose. Many of them carried similar scars, both visible and hidden, and something about sharing those burdens made them lighter to bear. The sound of tires on gravel caught his attention, and he looked out to see Daniel's car pulling up. His son had been coming around more often lately, finding reasons to drive down from D.C., even when there wasn't an official need. Frank suspected it had less to do with checking on him and more to do with seeking the peace they'd found in each other's company. "Perfect timing," Frank called out as Daniel stepped from the car. "I just put on a fresh pot of coffee." Daniel's smile was easy, relaxed, so different from the tense expression he'd worn during those darker days. "You know I never turn down your coffee, Dad." They settled onto the porch, their usual spot for these talks. The wooden swing creaked softly as they sat, a sound as familiar as breathing. 2 mugs steamed in their hands, and Rusty sprawled contentedly at their feet. "The garden's looking good," Daniel observed, nodding toward the neat rows of vegetables. "Those tomatoes might be your best crop yet," Frank chuckled. "Sarah says the same thing. She's been using them in the diner's BLTs." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "You know, I saw Tommy Wilson at church last Sunday. Remember him? Used to be so shy he'd hardly speak to anyone. Now he's helping organize the youth group activities." Daniel nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning. The community had changed, grown stronger through the challenge they'd faced together. "People surprise you sometimes," he said softly, "when they're given the chance to show their true colors." "That they do," Frank agreed, thinking of all the kindness he'd witnessed in recent weeks. The ladies from church bringing casseroles long after he'd recovered. The local mechanic installing extra security lights around his property, refusing payment. The children who would wave excitedly whenever they saw him in town. A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched the clouds drift overhead. The fear that had once lurked in these quiet moments was gone, replaced by a deep sense of peace. "You know," Frank said thoughtfully, "I keep thinking about something Sarah said the other day. She told me that standing up to that bully wasn't just about that one moment. It was about showing everyone that good people don't have to stay silent." Daniel turned to look at his father, pride evident in his eyes. "She's right. That's what you taught me growing up, even if I didn't always understand it then." Frank's weather-worn hands wrapped around his coffee mug, drawing comfort from its warmth. The morning sun had risen higher, burning away the last of the dew on his garden. In the distance, a church bell rang, its clear tones carrying across the peaceful countryside. "Sometimes," Frank mused, watching a pair of cardinals flit between the trees, "I think about how different things might have been if I'd just kept quiet that day in the diner. But then I remember something my own father used to say. Hate may strike, but love lasts longer." The aroma of Sarah's homemade apple pie mingled with the scent of grilled burgers as neighbors gathered on Frank's wraparound porch. The late Sunday afternoon sun painted everything in warm golden hues, casting long shadows across the freshly mowed lawn. Rusty lounged contentedly near the steps, occasionally thumping his tail when someone reached down to scratch behind his ears. Daniel stood at the grill, spatula in hand, chatting with Mr. Carter from the diner. The two men laughed easily, their conversation drifting across the porch where Frank sat in his favorite rocking chair, taking in the scene before him. "More lemonade, Frank?" Sarah approached with a pitcher, her smile as warm as the evening light. "Made it fresh this afternoon." "That'd be mighty nice, Sarah." Frank held out his glass, watching as she poured. "Sure appreciate you organizing all this." "Organizing?" Sarah chuckled. "All I did was mention to a few folks that Daniel was heading back tomorrow. Everyone else just showed up with food and smiles." Frank nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The porch was filled with familiar faces, neighbors he'd known for years, but had never truly known until recent events brought them together. Mrs. Thompson from the church choir had brought her famous potato salad. The Jenkins family from down the road had arrived with fresh corn on the cob. Even Sheriff Brooks had stopped by with his wife, bringing a huge bowl of coleslaw. "Food's ready," Daniel called out, and people began forming a line, paper plates in hand. Frank watched as his son served others first, just as he'd taught him years ago. Daniel had grown into such a fine man, strong yet gentle, powerful yet humble. The pride in Frank's chest swelled until he thought it might burst. "Here, Dad." Daniel appeared at his side with a loaded plate. "Got you the works burger, with all the fixings. Just how you like it." "Thanks, son." Frank accepted the plate, noting how Daniel had remembered to add extra pickles, just like when he was a boy. The porch filled with the sounds of contentment, forks scraping plates, ice cubes clinking in glasses, and the gentle murmur of conversation. Someone had brought a portable radio, and soft country music provided a peaceful backdrop to the gathering. "Remember when you used to host Sunday dinners here, Frank?" Mr. Carter asked from his spot near the railing. "Back when Mary was still with us?" Frank's heart squeezed at the mention of his late wife, but the pain wasn't as sharp as it used to be. Sure do. Mary loved nothing better than feeding a crowd. She'd be mighty proud of all this, Sarah added softly. Proud of both you Delaney men. Daniel settled into the chair next to his father, their shoulders nearly touching. Mom always said a home should be filled with love and laughter. That she did. Frank looked around at the gathered faces, all people who had stood by him during the dark days of harassment and fear. They'd brought light to his darkness, strength to his weakness. As the sun began its slow descent, casting purple and orange streaks across the sky, someone suggested they say grace. Hands joined across the porch, forming an unbroken circle of friendship and support. Dear Lord, Frank began, his voice steady and clear, we thank you for this food, this fellowship, and these friends who've become family. Thank you for showing us that love is stronger than hate, that community is stronger than fear. Amen. The group responded in unison. The evening continued with stories and shared memories. The Jenkins kids played with Rusty in the yard, while their parents reminisced about times past. Sheriff Brooks shared funny tales from his early days on the force, and Sarah entertained everyone with diner stories. As darkness began to settle, someone produced candles, setting them in mason jars around the porch. The soft light created a magical atmosphere, reminiscent of the night the community had gathered with candles to show their support. Frank observed it all from his rocking chair, his heart full to bursting. He was no longer the solitary veteran who ate breakfast alone at the diner. These people had embraced him, fought for him, stood beside him. They'd shown him that his worth wasn't measured by his past battles, but by the impact he had on others' lives. The stars began to appear, twinkling above like distant beacons of hope. Daniel excused himself from a conversation and returned to his father's side, settling into the neighboring rocker. Quite a send-off they've given me, Daniel said softly. Quite a community we've got here, Frank replied, his voice thick with emotion. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as fireflies began to dance in the gathering dusk. The sound of crickets joined the gentle conversations and distant laughter. Frank reached over and clasped his son's hand firmly. I've fought battles, son, he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. But this is the victory I'll carry to my grave. The simple words held profound truth. In his darkest moments, when hate had threatened to overwhelm him, love had proved stronger. When fear had tried to isolate him, community had embraced him. Here, surrounded by warmth and acceptance, Frank smiled, finally at peace, surrounded by love and belonging. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Frank Delaney, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.